The Spy's Redemption contents The Spy's Redemption full-length romance audiobook historical romance audiobook historical romance during the Napoleonic Wars. Disillusioned British spy Alexander is tasked with seducing French noblewoman Sophie for information. But as he falls for her genuine kindness and fierce patriotism, he's forced to choose between duty and a love that could cost him everything. This sweeping historical romance plunges you into a world of espionage, betrayal, and forbidden love, where loyalties are tested and the courage to choose love over duty can change the course of history. Experience the opulence of Parisian salons, the danger of war-torn France, and the undeniable chemistry between two souls caught on opposite sides of a deadly conflict. Chapter 1. A Shadow in the Salon. The Parisian salon glittered with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of perfume, expensive wine, and the low hum of whispered conversations. Alexander moved through the throng of elegantly dressed guests, a ghost in a tailored coat, his eyes scanning the room, searching for his target. He was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could blend into any crowd, his true identity hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed personas. Tonight, he was Monsieur Dubois, a wealthy merchant from the provinces, with a carefully cultivated air of bored indifference. His mission was simple, on the surface: infiltrate the inner circle of Comtesse Sophie de Valois, a woman rumored to have access to sensitive information regarding Napoleon's military strategies. She was a key figure in Parisian society, her salon a hub of political intrigue and whispered secrets. Alexander's superiors believed she held valuable intelligence, and it was his job to extract it by any means necessary. He'd been given a detailed dossier on the Comtesse, widowed young, fiercely patriotic, known for her sharp wit and unwavering loyalty to France. She was also, according to the reports, exceptionally beautiful. Alexander dismissed that detail as irrelevant. Beauty was a weapon, a tool to be used, not admired. He'd learned long ago that emotional attachments were a liability in his line of work. He spotted her across the room, surrounded by a gaggle of admirers, her laughter ringing out like a clear bell above the murmur of conversation. She was even more striking in person than her portrait had suggested. Her dark hair was piled high on her head, accentuating the elegant curve of her neck. Her eyes, a deep, luminous blue, sparkled with intelligence and a hint of melancholy. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk, its simple elegance a stark contrast to the overly ornate dresses of the other women in the room. Alexander watched her, assessing her, calculating his approach. He needed to get close to her, to gain her trust, to insinuate himself into her life. He was a master of seduction, not of the heart, but of the mind. He could weave a web of lies so intricate, so convincing, that his targets would willingly reveal their deepest secrets. He moved towards her, his steps measured, his demeanor carefully calibrated. He caught the eye of a portly gentleman standing near the Comtesse, a man he recognized from his intelligence briefings as a minor government official, known for his loose tongue and fondness for gossip. Monsieur Dubois, Alexander greeted the man, his voice smooth and unctuous, offering a slight bow. "A pleasure to see you again." The official, slightly flustered, squinted at him, his memory clearly failing him. "Monsieur Dubois?" he stammered. I don't believe we've met." Alexander smiled, a carefully crafted expression of amusement. My apologies," he said, his voice laced with a hint of self-deprecation. "I must have mistaken you for another gentleman. I'm new to Paris, you see. Still finding my way in this fascinating city." The official, relieved to be off the hook, puffed up with self-importance. "Paris can be overwhelming," he said, his voice booming. "But one must know the right people, the right circles." He gestured towards the Comtesse. "Take the Comtesse de Valois, for example. A woman of considerable influence." Alexander followed his gaze, his eyes lingering on Sophie. "Indeed," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She seems captivating." The official chuckled, a lecherous glint in his eyes. "Captivating and fiercely loyal to France. A dangerous combination. Wouldn't you agree?" "Dangerous, perhaps," Alexander said, his voice thoughtful. but also intriguing. He allowed the official to prattle on, feeding him carefully chosen questions, gleaning snippets of information about the Comtesse, her habits, her friends, her enemies. He learned that she was a patron of the arts, a skilled horsewoman, and a devout Catholic. He also learned that she was deeply involved in charitable work, supporting hospitals and orphanages throughout the city. The official, eager to impress this seemingly wealthy and influential newcomer, finally offered an introduction. "Monsieur Dubois," he said, puffing out his chest, "allow me to present you to the Comtesse de Valois." Alexander inclined his head, his heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. The game was afoot. He followed the official towards Sophie, his mind racing, calculating his every move, his every word. He was a shadow in the salon, a predator stalking his prey. But as he approached the Comtesse, as he met her gaze for the first time, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, something that threatened to disrupt his carefully constructed facade. It wasn't admiration, not exactly. It was recognition, a sense of something shared, something unspoken, a connection that defied logic and reason. And it was deeply, profoundly unsettling. The hunter, for the first time in his long and dangerous career, felt a flicker of doubt, a hint of vulnerability. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this mission would be unlike any he had undertaken before. This mission would test his skills, his loyalty, and his very soul. 17.5 S. Continued Chapter 2. The Lioness of Lion. Sophie de Valois felt the stranger's gaze before she saw him. It was a subtle pressure, a prickling of awareness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned, her eyes meeting those of the man the portly official was now introducing as Monsieur Dubois. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build, his dark hair brushed back from a high forehead, his eyes a striking shade of gray, intelligent and piercing. He had a strong jawline, a mouth that hinted at both sensuality and cynicism, and a subtle scar that traced the line of his left cheekbone, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He bowed, his movements graceful and precise, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "Comtesse," he said, his eyes holding hers. "A pleasure to meet you." Sophie inclined her head, her expression carefully neutral. "Monsieur Dubois," she replied, her voice cool and polite. "Welcome to my salon." She was accustomed to being admired, to being the object of male attention. But there was something different about this man, something that set him apart from the fawning courtiers and ambitious politicians who usually filled her salon. His gaze was intense, unwavering, as if he were trying to see beyond her carefully constructed facade, to penetrate the secrets she guarded so closely. The official, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling between them, launched into a rambling explanation of Monsieur Dubois's supposed wealth and influence. Sophie listened patiently, her mind racing. She was a keen observer of people, a skill honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of Parisian society. And she sensed that Monsieur Dubois was not what he seemed. There was a subtle tension in his body, a guardedness in his eyes, a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath his polished exterior. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator disguised as prey. And she, the Lioness of Lion, as she was known in certain circles, was not easily fooled. She'd earned that moniker for her fierce loyalty to France, her unwavering support for the emperor, and her secret involvement in aiding the resistance. She'd inherited her husband's vast estates after his death in battle, and she used her wealth and influence to support the war effort, providing funds, supplies, and safe haven for those who fought against the enemies of France. She knew the risks. She knew that one wrong move, one misplaced word, could lead to her arrest, imprisonment, even execution. But she was not afraid. She was a patriot, a warrior in her own right, fighting for her country, for her people, for the ideals she held dear. And she sensed that Monsieur Dubois, this enigmatic stranger with his piercing gray eyes, was a threat. He was a player in the game of espionage, a pawn in the larger conflict that was tearing Europe apart. And she needed to know which side he was on. She decided to test him, to probe his defenses, to see if she could uncover his true identity, his true intentions. "Monsieur Dubois," she said, her voice laced with a hint of challenge. "You say you're new to Paris. What brings you to our city?" He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Business, Comtesse," he said, his voice smooth. "And pleasure. I've heard much about the beauty and sophistication of Parisian society. I couldn't resist the opportunity to experience it for myself." "And what business is that, monsieur?" Sophie pressed, her gaze unwavering. He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I deal in commodities," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Import, export. The usual things." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "The usual things?" she repeated, her voice laced with irony. "Forgive me, monsieur, but you don't strike me as a man who deals in the usual things." He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps I'm more complex than I appear, Comtesse," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Perhaps you are," Sophie agreed, her voice soft. "But in these times, monsieur, complexity can be dangerous. One must be careful who one trusts." "Indeed, Comtesse," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Trust is a precious commodity, and easily broken." The conversation continued, a delicate dance of words, a subtle probing of defenses. Sophie found herself strangely drawn to this man, to his intelligence, his wit, his underlying sense of danger. He was a challenge, an enigma, a puzzle she was determined to solve. As the evening wore on, she introduced him to other guests, observing his interactions, noting his every move, his every word. He was a master of disguise, a chameleon who could adapt to any situation, any company. But Sophie sensed that beneath the mask, beneath the carefully constructed persona, there was a man of depth, of complexity, of hidden pain. And she, the lioness of lion, was intrigued. She was a hunter, too, and she had just found her prey. The game, she realized, was far more interesting than she had initially anticipated. And she was determined to win. The stakes were high, the dangers real, but she was not afraid. She was a warrior, and she would fight for her country, for her beliefs, and perhaps, just perhaps, for something more. Something she hadn't dared to dream of in a long, long time. 18.6s, continued Chapter 3. Whispers of Treason. Alexander knew he was being watched. He could feel Sophie's gaze on him throughout the evening, a subtle pressure, a constant reminder that he was walking a tightrope, one wrong move away from exposure. He played his part flawlessly, charming the other guests, engaging in witty banter, and carefully cultivating the persona of Monsieur Dubois, the wealthy and somewhat naive merchant. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing, calculating his every move, assessing every threat. He needed to get closer to Sophie, to gain her trust, to extract the information his superiors craved. But he also needed to be careful. She was intelligent, perceptive, and clearly suspicious. He managed to maneuver himself into several private conversations with her, using subtle flattery, carefully chosen words, and a hint of vulnerability to pique her interest. He spoke of his fabricated admiration for French culture, his feigned disillusionment with the war, and his manufactured desire for a peaceful life. He sensed a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of sympathy, perhaps even a spark of attraction. But he couldn't be sure. She was a master of disguise, too, her true feelings hidden beneath a mask of aristocratic composure. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander knew he needed to take a risk. He needed to create an opportunity to be alone with her, to further his investigation, to probe her defenses. He approached her as she was bidding farewell to her guests. "Comtesse," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I wonder if I might have a word with you in private. A matter of some delicacy." Sophie hesitated, her eyes searching his. He could see the suspicion there, the wariness, but also a flicker of curiosity. "Very well, Monsieur Dubois," she said, her voice cool. "Follow me." She led him to a small, secluded library, its walls lined with leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. The room was lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the floor, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and secrecy. Alexander closed the door behind them, his heart beating a steady, controlled rhythm. This was it. This was his chance. "Comtesse," he began, his voice carefully modulated. "I have a confession to make." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "A confession, monsieur?" she repeated, her voice laced with irony. "How intriguing." Alexander took a deep breath. I am not who I seem," he said, his voice low. "My name is not Dubois. And I am not a merchant." Sophie's expression didn't change, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of anticipation. "I am a sympathizer," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A supporter of a different cause." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, gauging her reaction. He was playing a dangerous game, revealing a sliver of truth, but twisting it to his advantage. He was gambling that her patriotism, her known support for the emperor, would make her receptive to his fabricated confession. Sophie remained silent for a moment, her gaze unwavering. Then she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "And what causes that, monsieur?" "Alexander," he supplied, offering his real name for the first time. "My name is Alexander, and the cause is peace. I believe this war is madness, Comtesse. A senseless waste of lives. I want to help end it." He was walking a fine line, revealing enough to pique her interest, but withholding the crucial truth that he was a British spy, her enemy, sworn to betray her. Sophie studied him, her eyes searching his. He could feel her scrutiny, her intelligence, her suspicion. He knew that she was weighing his words, assessing his credibility, trying to determine if he was genuine or a liar. "And how do you propose to help end it, Monsieur Alexander?" she asked, her voice still soft. He took a step closer, his gaze holding hers. "By providing information," he said, his voice low. "Information that could influence the outcome of the war. Information that could save lives." He was playing on her patriotism, her compassion, her known desire to protect her country. He was offering her a tempting bait, a chance to make a difference, to strike a blow against the enemies of France. But he was also leading her into a trap that could cost her everything. Sophie's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Information, you say?" she repeated, her voice laced with suspicion. "And what kind of information would that be?" Alexander hesitated, feigning reluctance. "Information about the British," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About their plans, their strategies, their weaknesses." He watched her closely, gauging her reaction. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by a spark of something else. Something that looked a lot like excitement. He'd hooked her. He'd planted the seed of suspicion, the hint of treason. Now he just needed to reel her in. But as he looked at her beautiful, intelligent face, at the flicker of hope in her eyes, he felt a pang of guilt, a sharp, stinging reminder of the deception he was perpetrating. He was playing a dangerous game, and she was the unsuspecting pawn. And the consequences for both of them could be devastating. The whispers of treason were in the air, and Alexander was the one whispering them, weaving a web of lies that threatened to ensnare them both. 22.7s, continue Chapter 4. A Dance of Deception. The following days were a carefully choreographed dance of deception. Alexander, posing as a disillusioned sympathizer, continued to cultivate his relationship with Sophie, feeding her carefully selected pieces of false information about British military plans. He met with her regularly, sometimes at her salon, sometimes in more private settings, a secluded garden, a quiet cafe, a clandestine rendezvous in a dimly lit art gallery. He learned more about her, her life, her passions, her beliefs. He discovered that she was a patron of a local orphanage, that she spent hours tending to the wounded in a makeshift hospital, that she had a deep love for music and poetry. He saw her kindness, her compassion, her unwavering loyalty to her country. And with each passing day, his guilt grew stronger, his internal conflict more intense. He was falling for her genuine goodness, for her sharp wit, for her unwavering spirit. He was supposed to be betraying her, using her, exploiting her for his own gain. But he found himself increasingly drawn to her, increasingly protective of her, increasingly desperate to find a way out of the web of lies he'd woven. Sophie, in turn, found herself increasingly intrigued by Alexander. She still harbored suspicions, still sensed that he was holding something back, but she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt towards him. He was intelligent, charming, and undeniably handsome. He challenged her, stimulated her, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt since her husband's death. She also believed she was using him. She knew he was a spy of some sort, and she intended to exploit his connection to the British to gain valuable intelligence for the French resistance. She played her part flawlessly, feigning trust, encouraging his confidences, carefully extracting information from him while revealing nothing of her own secret activities. They were both playing a dangerous game, both deceiving each other, both walking a tightrope between truth and lies, between loyalty and betrayal. But beneath the surface, a genuine connection was forming, a spark of attraction that threatened to ignite into a full-blown conflagration. One evening, Alexander arranged a private meeting with Sophie at a secluded garden overlooking the Seine. The air was warm and fragrant, the scent of roses and jasmine filling the air. The moon cast a silvery glow over the city, creating a romantic, almost ethereal atmosphere. Alexander had brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. They sat on a stone bench, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. "This is beautiful," Sophie said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "It is," Alexander agreed, his eyes on her. He poured them each a glass of wine, their hands brushing as he handed her hers. A spark of electricity seemed to pass between them, a silent acknowledgement of the growing attraction. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing. They discussed politics, art, music, literature. They shared stories about their lives, carefully edited versions, of course, omitting the crucial details that would reveal their true identities. Alexander found himself captivated by Sophie's intelligence, her passion, her unwavering spirit. He saw a glimpse of the woman beneath the mask, the vulnerable, compassionate, fiercely loyal woman who had captured his heart. He knew he was playing with fire, that he was risking everything, but he couldn't help himself. He was falling in love with his enemy, with the woman he was supposed to betray. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Alexander took a risk. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. Sophie didn't pull away. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and earnest. I care about you. More than I should." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was confessing his feelings, but also acknowledging the dangerous reality of their situation. Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, a hint of reciprocation, but also a lingering shadow of doubt. "Alexander," she said, her voice soft but firm. I care about you too. But we must be careful. We are on opposite sides of a war. Our loyalties are divided." "I know," Alexander said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I can't help how I feel." He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a question rather than a demand. Sophie responded, her lips parting slightly, her hand reaching up to caress his cheek. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken desires, of forbidden longings, of a love that defied logic and reason. But it was also a kiss steeped in deception, a kiss built on a foundation of lies. And as they broke apart, both Alexander and Sophie knew that their dance of deception had just become infinitely more complicated, more dangerous, and more heartbreaking. The lines between truth and lies, between loyalty and betrayal, were blurring, and the consequences of their actions were becoming increasingly unpredictable. They were playing with fire, and they were both about to get burned. 36.3s, continue Chapter 5. The mask begins to slip. The kiss changed everything. It was a crack in the carefully constructed facades they had both built, a glimpse of the genuine emotions that simmered beneath the surface. For Alexander, it was a moment of both profound joy and agonizing guilt. He was falling deeper in love with Sophie, but he knew that his deception was a ticking time bomb, threatening to destroy everything. For Sophie, the kiss was a confirmation of her growing feelings for Alexander, but it also heightened her suspicions. She knew he was hiding something, and she was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking her heart in the process. Their meetings became more frequent, more intense, more charged with unspoken emotions. They continued their dance of deception, each playing their part, but the lines between their roles and their true feelings were becoming increasingly blurred. Alexander found himself struggling to maintain his composure, to keep his mask from slipping. He was haunted by nightmares, visions of Sophie discovering his betrayal, of her being imprisoned, tortured, even executed because of his actions. He started to make mistakes, small slips of the tongue, inconsistencies in his stories, moments of unguarded emotion that threatened to expose his true identity. He was becoming reckless, driven by his love for Sophie and his desperate desire to protect her. One evening, they were walking along the Seine, the city lights twinkling around them. Alexander, caught up in a moment of vulnerability, let slip a detail about his past, a reference to his training in England, a skill that was distinctly British, not French. Sophie stopped walking, her eyes narrowing, her gaze fixed on him. "England?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "What do you know about England, Monsieur Dubois?" Alexander froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd made a mistake, a potentially fatal error. He tried to backtrack, to cover his tracks, but he knew it was too late. "I merely meant," he stammered, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Sophie's eyes were like ice, her expression hardening. "Don't lie to me, Alexander," she said, her voice cold. "I know you're hiding something. I know you're not who you say you are." Alexander felt a wave of despair wash over him. The game was up. His deception had been exposed. He looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame, regret, and a desperate plea for understanding. "Sophie," he said, his voice low. I can explain." "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Explain that you're a British spy? That you've been using me, manipulating me, betraying me?" The words were like daggers, piercing his heart. He'd known this moment would come, but he hadn't been prepared for the raw pain, the crushing weight of her accusation. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I am a spy. But it's not what you think. I never meant to hurt you." Sophie stared at him, her eyes blazing with anger, with hurt, with a profound sense of betrayal. "You lied to me," she said, her voice trembling. "From the very beginning. You played me for a fool." "I know," Alexander said, his voice heavy with remorse. "And I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I fell in love with you, Sophie. Despite everything, despite the lies, despite the danger, I fell in love with you." His confession hung in the air, a desperate plea for forgiveness, a testament to the genuine feelings that had blossomed amidst the deception. Sophie's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something other than anger crossing her face. But it was quickly replaced by a renewed surge of fury. "Love?" she scoffed, her voice laced with bitterness. "You don't know the meaning of the word. Love is about trust, about honesty, about loyalty. You have shown me none of those things." She turned away from him, her body shaking with emotion. "Get out," she said, her voice cold. "Get out of my sight. I never want to see you again." Alexander felt his world crumble around him. He'd lost everything. His mission, his honor, and the woman he loved. He reached out to her, his hand hovering over her arm, but he stopped himself. He had no right to touch her, no right to comfort her. He'd caused her enough pain. "Sophie," he said, his voice pleading. "Please let me explain. Let me make amends." She turned back to him, her eyes filled with tears. "There's nothing you can do, Alexander," she said, her voice breaking. "You've destroyed everything. You've broken my heart." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Alexander alone with his guilt, his regret, and the crushing weight of his shattered dreams. The mask had slipped, revealing the truth, and the consequences were devastating. He'd lost the woman he loved, and he had no one to blame but himself. The dance of deception was over, and the music had stopped. All that remained was the silence of heartbreak and the bitter taste of betrayal. 16.0 Continue Chapter 6. Beneath the Parisian moon. Alexander didn't leave Paris. He couldn't. He was a broken man, stripped of his purpose, his honor, and his love. He haunted the streets, a ghost in the city he had once navigated with such confidence, his every thought consumed by Sophie, by her pain, by his desperate need to make amends. He knew he should report back to his superiors, to inform them of his failure, to face the consequences of his actions. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He was trapped, paralyzed by guilt and regret, unable to move forward, unable to go back. He spent his days wandering aimlessly, avoiding the places he had shared with Sophie, the memories too painful to bear. He spent his nights in dimly lit taverns, drinking himself into oblivion, trying to escape the crushing weight of his despair. He knew he was being watched. His superiors would be looking for him, wondering why he hadn't reported in. He was a liability, a loose end that needed to be tied up. But he didn't care. He had nothing left to lose. One night, as he was stumbling through the streets, drunk and despondent, he saw a familiar figure ahead of him. It was Sophie. She was walking quickly, her head down, her body wrapped in a dark cloak. She looked different. Thinner, paler, her usual air of confidence replaced by a haunted, almost fearful expression. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He had to talk to her, to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness, even though he knew it was hopeless. He quickened his pace, catching up to her, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. "Sophie," he called out, his voice rough. She startled, turning to face him, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. "Alexander?" she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here?" I had to see you," he said, his voice slurred. "I had to apologize. I'm so sorry, Sophie. For everything." She stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and something else. Something that looked a lot like pity. "You should leave Paris, Alexander," she said, her voice cold. "You're not safe here." "I don't care about safety," he said, his voice desperate. "I care about you. I love you, Sophie. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, give me another chance." Sophie shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's too late, Alexander," she said, her voice breaking. "You broke my trust. You broke my heart." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. "But I can make it right. I can help you. I can use my knowledge, my skills, to protect you." Sophie looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Protect me?" she repeated, her voice questioning. "From whom?" Alexander hesitated. He knew he was taking a risk, revealing information that could put him in even greater danger. But he didn't care. He had to protect Sophie, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "From my superiors," he said, his voice low. "They know about you, Sophie. They know about your involvement with the resistance. They're planning to arrest you." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. How do you know that?" she whispered. "I overheard them talking," Alexander said, his voice urgent. "They're planning to use you as bait, to lure out other members of the resistance. They're going to torture you, to force you to betray your friends." Sophie's face paled, her body trembling with fear. She knew the risk she was taking, but she'd never imagined that the British would target her directly. "I have to warn them," she said, her voice desperate. I have to get away." "There's no time," Alexander said, his voice firm. "They're watching you, Sophie. They'll be here any minute." He grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "Come with me," he said, his voice urgent. "I know a place where you'll be safe. I can help you escape." Sophie hesitated, her eyes searching his. She was torn between her distrust of him, her anger at his betrayal, and her desperate need to survive. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows, her body tensing with fear. She knew Alexander was right. She was in danger, and he was her only hope. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I trust you. It was a lie, a desperate gamble. She didn't trust him, not completely. But she had no other choice. Alexander pulled her into a narrow alleyway, his body shielding hers. He led her through a maze of dark, twisting streets, his senses on high alert, his every instinct focused on protecting her. They were running, not from the British, but with a British spy, a man who had betrayed her, a man who had broken her heart, but also a man who was now risking everything to save her. The Parisian moon cast long shadows around them, illuminating their desperate flight, a silent witness to their unlikely alliance, their shared danger, and the lingering spark of a love that had been forged in deception, but was now being tested in the crucible of survival. 50.6s Continue Chapter 7.
Stolen moments, stolen kisses.
Alexander led Sophie to a small, dilapidated apartment in a forgotten corner of Paris. It was one of his many safe houses, a place he'd used in the past for clandestine meetings and temporary refuge. It was sparsely furnished, dusty, and smelled of mildew, but it was secure, hidden from prying eyes, and far from the reach of his superiors. He locked the door behind them, his hand still holding Sophie's. He could feel her trembling, her fear palpable. "We'll be safe here," he said, his voice reassuring, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. He knew his superiors were ruthless, relentless. They wouldn't give up easily. Sophie looked around the room, her eyes wide with apprehension. "For how long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alexander didn't answer. He didn't know. He was making this up as he went along, improvising, driven by his desperate need to protect her. He released her hand, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He walked over to a dusty window, peering out into the darkness, his senses on high alert. "We need a plan," he said, his voice thoughtful. "We need to get you out of Paris, out of France. Somewhere they can't find you." Sophie nodded, her body still shaking. "But how?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. "My family, my friends, I can't just leave them." Alexander turned to face her, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But you have to. It's the only way to protect them. If you're captured, they'll use you to get to them." He saw the tears in her eyes, the fear, the desperation. He wanted to take her in his arms, to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right. But he knew he couldn't.
He'd lost that right.
He forced himself to focus on the practicalities, on the logistics of their escape. He needed to find a way to get them forged papers, transportation, a safe passage out of the country. He had contacts, of course, remnants of his former life as a spy, but he didn't know if he could trust them. He spent the next few hours pacing the room, his mind racing, weighing his options, calculating the risks. Sophie sat on a rickety chair, watching him, her silence a heavy weight in the small, confined space. As dawn approached, Alexander finally had a plan, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. He explained it to Sophie, outlining the risks, the dangers, the potential consequences. She listened intently, her eyes fixed on his face, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew she had no other choice. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "I'm ready." Alexander felt a surge of admiration for her courage, her resilience, her unwavering spirit. He'd betrayed her, lied to her, broken her heart. And yet, she was still willing to trust him, to follow him, to risk everything for a chance at freedom. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "For trusting me. I won't let you down." His touch, his words, sent a shiver down her spine. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the genuine remorse, the unwavering determination to protect her. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his. It was a soft, tentative kiss, a hesitant exploration, a question rather than a demand. Alexander responded, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a kiss filled with unspoken emotions, with forgiveness, with gratitude, with a desperate longing for a future that might never be. It was a stolen moment, a stolen kiss, a brief respite from the danger that surrounded them. They were two enemies, bound together by circumstance, by betrayal, by a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. They knew it was madness, that it was reckless, that it could cost them everything.
But they couldn't help themselves.
They were drawn to each other, pulled together by an invisible force, a connection that defied logic and reason. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty window, they broke apart, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged. They knew they had to move, to put their plan into action, to face the dangers that awaited them. But in that stolen moment, in that stolen kiss, they had found a glimmer of hope, a spark of love, a reason to keep fighting, to keep believing, to keep hoping for a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. They were running, not just from their enemies, but towards a possibility, a chance, a dream of a life together, a life free from deception, free from war, free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. 18.2s, continue Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. The escape plan was fraught with peril. Alexander contacted a former associate, a smuggler named Jean-Luc, who operated in the shadowy underworld of occupied Paris. Jean-Luc was a mercenary, driven by profit, not loyalty, but he was also discreet, efficient, and had a network of contacts that stretched across the continent. Alexander met Jean-Luc in a dimly lit tavern, the air thick with smoke and the murmur of hushed conversations. He explained the situation, omitting the details of his own betrayal, presenting himself as a British agent trying to extract a valuable asset. Jean-Luc, a burly man with a scarred face and a cynical eye, listened impassively, his gaze fixed on Alexander. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice gruff. "And expensive." Alexander nodded. "I'm prepared to pay." He'd already anticipated this, using the last of his funds, money he'd saved for emergencies, to secure Jean-Luc's cooperation. He was gambling everything on this, his own life, Sophie's safety, and the slim chance of a future together. They agreed on a price, a rendezvous point, and a time. Jean-Luc would provide forged papers, disguises, and transportation to the coast, where a small fishing boat would take them across the channel to England. Alexander returned to the safe house, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. He explained the plan to Sophie, outlining the risks, the dangers, the potential consequences. She listened intently, her eyes fixed on his face, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew she had no other choice. "I trust you, Alexander," she said, her voice firm. It wasn't entirely true. She still harbored doubts, still felt the sting of his betrayal. But she trusted his desperation, his determination to protect her, his love, which she could no longer deny, even to herself. They spent the remaining hours preparing for their escape, gathering the few belongings they had, destroying any evidence of their presence in the apartment. Alexander showed Sophie how to use a small pistol he'd kept hidden, a last resort, a desperate measure in case they were cornered. As darkness fell, they donned their disguises, Alexander as a humble priest, Sophie as his ailing sister. It was a simple ruse, but it might be enough to get them through the checkpoints, to avoid the watchful eyes of the French authorities and Alexander's former colleagues. They left the safe house, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. They moved through the darkened streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the shadows, their every step fraught with danger. They reached the rendezvous point, a deserted alleyway near the Seine, their breaths misting in the cold night air. Jean-Luc was waiting for them, his face hidden in the shadows, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. He handed them the forged papers, a curt nod his only acknowledgement. "The carriage is waiting," he said, his voice gruff. "Be quick.
And be careful."
They climbed into the back of a nondescript carriage, the driver, a silent, shadowy figure, urging the horses forward. The carriage rattled through the streets, each jolt, each turn, a potential threat, a potential disaster. Alexander held Sophie's hand, his grip tight, his presence a source of comfort in the darkness. He could feel her trembling, her fear mirroring his own. They reached the outskirts of Paris, the city lights fading behind them, the countryside stretching out before them, dark and unknown. They were leaving behind everything they knew, everything they had ever been, venturing into a future that was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with the promise of both hope and despair. But as they rode through the night, as they left behind the whispers of treason, the shadows of betrayal, and the echoes of goodbye, they knew they were not alone. They had each other, and that, for now, was enough. The price of loyalty was high, but they were willing to pay it for each other, for their love, for the slim chance of a future together, a future free from the darkness that had haunted them for so long. The road ahead was long and treacherous, but they were ready to face it, hand in hand, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope, their love a beacon in the darkness. 55.9 S. Continue Chapter 9. A Web of Lies. The journey to the coast was agonizingly slow, each mile fraught with danger, each checkpoint a potential trap. Alexander and Sophie maintained their disguises, playing their roles with a desperate intensity, their lives hanging in the balance. Alexander's knowledge of the French countryside, gleaned from his years as a spy, proved invaluable. He navigated the back roads, avoided the main thoroughfares, and used his charm and wit to talk their way past suspicious guards and inquisitive officials. Sophie, despite her fear, played her part flawlessly. She feigned illness, her body slumped against Alexander's, her voice weak and trembling. She even managed to shed a few genuine tears, her acting skills honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of Parisian society. But beneath the surface, the tension between them was palpable. They were bound together by circumstance, by danger, by a shared need for survival. But the web of lies that Alexander had woven still separated them, a constant reminder of his betrayal, a barrier to the trust that was so essential for their survival. They spoke little, their conversations limited to the necessities of their escape. But their eyes met often, their gazes filled with unspoken emotions, fear, hope, regret, and a lingering spark of the love that had blossomed amidst the deception. One evening, as they were sheltering in a deserted barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and damp earth, Sophie confronted Alexander. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes searching his. "Why are you risking your life for me? After everything you've done?" Alexander hesitated. He could have lied, could have offered a fabricated explanation, a noble sentiment about redemption or atonement. But he couldn't. Not anymore. He owed her the truth, at least a part of it. "Because I love you, Sophie," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've betrayed you in the worst possible way. But I can't stand the thought of anything happening to you. I have to protect you, even if it means sacrificing myself." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his confession. He'd admitted his love, his guilt, his desperate need to make amends. Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable. She was torn between her anger, her hurt, her lingering suspicion, and the undeniable pull she felt towards him, the spark of love that refused to be extinguished. I don't know what to believe anymore, Alexander," she said, her voice trembling. "You've lied to me so many times. How can I trust anything you say?" "I know," Alexander said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I understand your doubts. But please, Sophie, believe this. I love you, and I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. She didn't pull away. "I want to believe you, Alexander," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's hard. So hard." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a soft, tentative kiss, a plea for forgiveness, a promise of a future that might never be. Sophie responded, her lips parting slightly, her arms wrapping around his neck. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense. It was a kiss filled with unspoken emotions, with longing, with regret, with a desperate hope for redemption. But even as they kissed, Even as they clung to each other in the darkness, the web of lies that surrounded them remained, a constant threat, a barrier to the true intimacy they both craved. They were two lovers, bound together by a shared danger, but separated by a past filled with deception and betrayal. The journey ahead was still uncertain, the dangers still real, and the future still hanging in the balance. But in that stolen moment, in that desperate kiss, they found a glimmer of hope, a spark of love, a reason to keep fighting, to keep believing, to keep hoping for a future that was still within their reach, even if it was shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. 29.7s. Continue Chapter 10. The Enemy Within. They reached the coast, a desolate stretch of sand and wind-swept dunes. The fishing boat, a small, unassuming vessel, was waiting for them, bobbing gently in the waves. Jean-Luc, his face grim, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, greeted them with a curt nod. "You're late," he said, his voice gruff. "We had some complications," Alexander replied, his voice carefully neutral. He didn't elaborate, knowing that the less Jean-Luc knew, the better. Jean-Luc grunted, his gaze lingering on Sophie. "Get on board," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "And stay out of sight." They climbed aboard the boat, the smell of salt and fish filling their nostrils. The small cabin was cramped and damp, but it was a refuge, a temporary sanctuary from the dangers they had left behind. As the boat pulled away from the shore, Sophie looked back at the receding coastline, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. She was leaving behind her home, her country, her family, everything she had ever known. But she was also escaping a certain death, a fate that would have been far worse than exile. Alexander sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a source of comfort in the darkness. He could feel her trembling, her fear palpable. "We'll be all right, Sophie," he said, his voice reassuring, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. He knew that their journey was far from over, that dangers still awaited them, both at sea and in England. But as the boat sailed through the night, as the waves crashed against the hull, as the wind howled around them, a new threat emerged, a threat that Alexander hadn't anticipated, a threat that came from within. Jean-Luc, it turned out, was not just a smuggler. He was also an informant, a double agent who worked for both the French and the British, selling his services to the highest bidder. He'd been contacted by Alexander's superiors, informed of his betrayal, and offered a substantial reward for his capture. As the boat neared the English coast, Jean-Luc and his crew, two burly men with menacing expressions, cornered Alexander and Sophie on the deck. "I'm afraid this is where our journey ends," Jean-Luc said, his voice laced with a cruel satisfaction. He drew a pistol, pointing it at Alexander's chest. "You're worth more to me alive, spy. But the woman, she's expendable." Alexander's heart leaped into his throat. He'd been so focused on escaping the French authorities that he'd overlooked the possibility of betrayal from within. He'd underestimated Jean-Luc's greed, his ruthlessness, his willingness to sell them out. He stepped in front of Sophie, shielding her with his body. "Don't touch her," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Jean-Luc chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed across the deck. "You're in no position to make demands, spy," he said. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of luck." Alexander knew he was right. He was trapped, cornered, facing certain death. But he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let Sophie be harmed. He would fight to the end, even if it meant sacrificing himself. The enemy within had revealed himself, a traitor lurking in the shadows, reminder that in the world of espionage, trust was a luxury that no one could afford. The price of loyalty had just gone up, and Alexander was about to pay the ultimate price. The sea, once a symbol of escape, had become a trap, a battleground where loyalty, betrayal, and love would collide in a final, desperate confrontation. 13.9s. Continue Chapter 11. Flight of the Sparrow. Sophie refused to be a passive victim. While Alexander faced Jean-Luc, she subtly reached for the small pistol hidden in her cloak, the weapon Alexander had given her back in the Paris safe house. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was firm. She wouldn't let Jean-Luc harm Alexander, not without a fight. As Jean-Luc was gloating, savoring his moment of triumph, Sophie acted. She swiftly drew the pistol, aimed and fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the deck. Jean-Luc gasped, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. He staggered backward, clutching his arm, the pistol slipping from his grasp. Alexander, momentarily stunned by Sophie's unexpected action, quickly regained his composure. He lunged forward, tackling Jean-Luc to the deck, disarming him completely. The two crewmen, momentarily shocked by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. Alexander seized the opportunity, delivering a series of swift, brutal blows, incapacitating them both. The fight was over in seconds. Jean-Luc and his crew were subdued, their threat neutralized. Alexander turned to Sophie, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice breathless. Sophie nodded, her body still trembling from the adrenaline surge. I am now," she said, her voice shaky. She looked at the pistol in her hand, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She'd never fired a weapon before, never imagined herself capable of such violence. But she'd done it. She'd saved Alexander's life, and her own. Alexander took the pistol from her, his hand gently covering hers. "You were amazing, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You saved us both." Sophie looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the gratitude in his gaze, the admiration, the love. She also saw a flicker of something else, fear. He was afraid for her, afraid of what she'd had to do, afraid of the consequences. I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Alexander said, his voice gentle. "And I'm so proud of you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace a haven of safety in the midst of the chaos. They stood there for a long time, clinging to each other, the silence broken only by the sound of the waves and their ragged breaths. The flight of the sparrow, as Sophie would later call it, had been a baptism by fire, a moment of unexpected courage, a turning point in their relationship. She had proven her strength, her resilience, her willingness to fight for what she believed in. She was no longer just a victim, a pawn in a game of espionage. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman who had stared death in the face and emerged victorious. They had survived the betrayal, they had overcome the enemy within, but the journey was far from over. They still had to reach England, to evade Alexander's superiors, to find a way to build a life together, a life free from the shadows of their past. But for now, in that stolen moment on the deck of a smuggler's boat, they had each other. And that was enough. The sparrow, once caged by deception and fear, had taken flight, soaring towards an uncertain future, but soaring nonetheless, her wings strengthened by courage, by love, and by the unwavering support of the man who had once been her enemy, but was now her protector, her lover, her partner in a desperate fight for freedom. 15.5s continued Chapter 12. Crossroads of Fate. They reached the English coast under the cover of darkness, a small, desolate beach shrouded in mist. Alexander, using his contacts and his knowledge of the area, arranged for a local fisherman to transport them inland to a safe house he maintained in a remote village. The journey was tense, silent, both Alexander and Sophie acutely aware of the dangers that still surrounded them. They were fugitives, hunted by both the French and the British, their lives hanging in the balance. They reached the safe house, a small, unassuming cottage overlooking the sea, its walls weathered by the wind and rain. It was a far cry from the opulent salons of Paris, but it was a refuge, a temporary sanctuary from the storm that raged around them. Alexander secured the cottage, checking for any signs of surveillance, his senses on high alert. He was a hunted man now, his former life as a spy a distant memory, his only focus on protecting Sophie and finding a way to build a future together. Sophie watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a lingering sense of unease. She had trusted him with her life, and he had saved her, more than once. But she still couldn't fully shake the doubts, the memories of his betrayal, the knowledge that he was a man of secrets, a man who had lived a life of deception. As they settled into the cottage, a sense of exhaustion washed over them. They had been running for days, fueled by adrenaline and fear, their bodies and minds pushed to the limit. They built a fire in the hearth, the warmth a welcome contrast to the damp chill of the cottage. They ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, their silence punctuated by the crackling of the flames and the distant roar of the sea. After the meal, Alexander turned to Sophie, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and concern. "You need to rest," he said, his voice gentle. "You've been through so much." Sophie nodded, her body aching with fatigue. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that they were standing at a crossroads, that their future was uncertain, that their love was still a fragile thing, threatened by the shadows of their past. "Alexander," she said, her voice low, her eyes searching his. "What happens now? What happens to us?" Alexander hesitated. He didn't have the answers. He'd been improvising, driven by instinct and a desperate need to protect Sophie. He hadn't thought beyond their escape, beyond their immediate survival. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I need to think. I need to find a way to clear my name, to make things right." He knew it was a long shot, a near impossible task. He was a traitor in the eyes of his superiors, a fugitive from justice. He had no allies, no resources, no hope of redemption. But he had Sophie. And that was enough to keep him going, to keep him fighting, to keep him believing in the possibility of a future together. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firmer now, his eyes filled with determination. "Together. We'll find a way." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a sigh escaping her lips. "I love you, Alexander," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she'd said those words to him since his confession, since his betrayal. Alexander's heart swelled with emotion. Her words were a gift, a precious treasure, a sign that despite everything, their love had survived. "I love you too, Sophie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers. It was a kiss filled with tenderness, with gratitude, with a desperate longing for a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. They were at a crossroads of fate, their lives hanging in the balance. The path ahead was fraught with danger, with uncertainty, with the potential for both heartbreak and redemption. But they were together. And in that moment, in that stolen kiss, in that shared embrace, they found the strength to face whatever lay ahead, their love a beacon in the darkness, a guiding light towards a future that was still within their reach, even if it was shrouded in mist and uncertainty. 14.6s, continued Chapter 13. The Scars of War. The relative peace of the safe house was shattered by the harsh realities of their situation. Alexander knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. His former superiors would be searching for him, and Sophie was still in danger from the French authorities. He needed to find a way to clear his name, to protect Sophie, and to secure their future. He decided to take a risk, a desperate gamble that could either save them or condemn them both. He contacted a former colleague, a man named Thomas Ashton, who he'd worked with on previous missions. Ashton was a man of integrity, a loyal soldier, but also a man who valued justice and truth above blind obedience. Alexander arranged a clandestine meeting with Ashton, choosing a remote location, a deserted church on the outskirts of a nearby village. He knew he was taking a huge risk, exposing himself to potential capture, but he had no other choice. He left Sophie at the safe house, promising to return as soon as possible. He could see the fear in her eyes, the worry, the lingering doubt. But he also saw the trust, the love, the unwavering belief in him that had somehow survived all the betrayals and deceptions. "Be careful, Alexander," she said, her voice trembling, her hand gripping his. "I will," he promised, his voice firm. "I'll come back for you. I swear it." He kissed her, a long, lingering kiss filled with unspoken emotions, with promises, with hope, with a desperate longing for a future together. The meeting with Ashton was tense, fraught with danger. Alexander explained his situation, his betrayal, his love for Sophie, his desperate need for help. He showed Ashton the forged papers, the evidence of his escape, the proof of his commitment to protecting Sophie. Ashton listened intently, his expression unreadable, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He knew Alexander's reputation, his skills, his ruthlessness. He also knew that Alexander was capable of deception, of manipulation, of betrayal. "Why should I trust you, Alexander?" Ashton asked, his voice cold. "You're a traitor. You've broken your oath. You've endangered countless lives." "I know," Alexander admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'm prepared to face the consequences. But Sophie, she's innocent. She deserves to be protected." He pleaded with Ashton, his voice raw with emotion, his desperation palpable. He offered himself up as a prisoner, willing to face whatever punishment awaited him, if only Ashton would help him secure Sophie's safety. Ashton studied him, his gaze unwavering. He saw the sincerity in Alexander's eyes, the genuine remorse, the unwavering love for Sophie that shone through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He also saw the scars of war, the emotional wounds that had driven Alexander to this desperate act, the moral compromises that had haunted him for years. He saw a man broken by his profession, a man seeking redemption, a man willing to sacrifice everything for the woman he loved. Finally, Ashton nodded, his expression softening slightly. "All right, Alexander," he said, his voice firm. "I believe you. I'll help you." It was a turning point, a moment of unexpected grace, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. But it was also the beginning of a new chapter, a new set of challenges, a new set of dangers. Alexander had found an ally, a potential savior. But he also knew that the road ahead was still long and treacherous, that the scars of war, both physical and emotional, would continue to haunt them, that the price of redemption would be high, and that the future was still uncertain. He had taken a leap of faith, and he could only hope that it would lead them to safety, to freedom, and to a love that could finally heal the wounds of the past. The deserted church, a symbol of faith and redemption, had become a sanctuary, a place where hope had been rekindled, where alliances had been forged, and where the seeds of a new beginning had been sown. 23.4s Continue Chapter 14. A Glimmer of Hope. With Ashton's help, Alexander began to unravel the web of lies and deceit that had ensnared him. Ashton, using his connections within the British intelligence service, discreetly investigated Alexander's claims, verifying his story, gathering evidence of his innocence in the original mission, and exposing the ruthless ambition of his superior officer, Colonel Davies. It turned out that Davies had been manipulating Alexander, using him as a pawn in a larger game of power and influence. Davies had deliberately fabricated intelligence, feeding Alexander false information to further his own career, even if it meant sacrificing innocent lives. The investigation was slow and painstaking, fraught with danger. Alexander and Sophie remained in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing who to trust. But with each passing day, the evidence against Davies mounted, the truth began to emerge, and a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Alexander's name was slowly being cleared, his reputation restored, his honor redeemed. Sophie, initially skeptical of Ashton's involvement, gradually began to trust him. She saw his genuine concern for Alexander, his commitment to justice, his unwavering loyalty to his friend. She also saw the respect he had for her, the admiration for her courage and resilience. Ashton became a regular visitor to their safe houses, bringing them news, supplies, and a much-needed connection to the outside world. He also brought them stories of the war, of the ongoing conflict between Britain and France, of the sacrifices being made on both sides. These stories stirred something within Sophie, a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to contribute to the fight for freedom, even in exile. She realized that she couldn't just sit idly by, waiting for her fate to be decided. She had skills, knowledge, connections that could be useful. She began to work with Ashton, discreetly, using her contacts in France to gather intelligence, to provide information that could help the British war effort. She was walking a dangerous path, risking exposure and capture, but she was driven by a fierce determination to make a difference, to contribute to the cause of justice, to fight for a better future. Alexander, initially hesitant to involve Sophie in his dangerous world, eventually relented. He saw her strength, her determination, her unwavering spirit. He also realized that she needed this, that she needed to feel useful, to feel like she was contributing to something larger than herself. They worked together, a team, their love for each other a source of strength and inspiration. They were still fugitives, still hunted, still facing an uncertain future. But they were no longer alone. They had each other, they had Ashton, and they had a renewed sense of purpose, a glimmer of hope that one day they would be free. The glimmer of hope was fragile, easily extinguished by the winds of war and the shadows of betrayal. But it was there, burning brightly in their hearts, guiding them through the darkness, illuminating their path towards a future that was still within their reach, even if it was shrouded in uncertainty and danger. They were fighting not just for survival, but for redemption, for justice, and for a love that had been tested by fire, but had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. 59.4 S. Continue Chapter 15. The Reckoning. The reckoning came swiftly and brutally. Colonel Davies, realizing that his web of deceit was unraveling, decided to take matters into his own hands. He discovered Alexander and Sophie's location, using his network of informants and his ruthless determination to eliminate the threat they posed to his career. He arrived at their safe house with a squad of soldiers, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes filled with a chilling determination. He was not there to arrest them, he was there to silence them, permanently. Alexander and Sophie were caught off guard, their preparations incomplete, their escape route compromised. They were trapped, cornered, facing overwhelming odds. A fierce firefight erupted, the quiet cottage shattering under a hail of bullets. Alexander, using his skills as a spy and a soldier, fought with a desperate intensity, protecting Sophie, buying them time, trying to find a way out of the trap. Sophie, armed with the pistol Alexander had given her, fought alongside him, her courage and determination unwavering. She was no longer a passive victim, a pawn in a game of espionage. She was a warrior, fighting for her life, for her love, for her future. Ashton, alerted to the attack by one of his informants, arrived with reinforcements, a small squad of loyal soldiers who were willing to risk their lives to protect Alexander and expose Davies' treachery. The battle raged, the cottage echoing with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Alexander and Sophie fought back to back, their movements synchronized, their love for each other a shield against the chaos and violence that surrounded them. But Davies was relentless, his soldiers numerous, his determination fueled by a desperate need to silence the truth. He cornered Alexander, his pistol aimed at his heart, his face twisted with hatred. "You should have stayed dead, spy," Davies snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Sophie, seeing Alexander's imminent danger, acted without hesitation. She threw herself in front of Alexander, shielding him with her body, taking the bullet that was meant for him. Alexander screamed her name, his heart shattering into a million pieces. He caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her, his tears mixing with her blood. The world seemed to stop, the sounds of battle fading into a distant hum. All that mattered was Sophie, her life ebbing away in his arms.
Sophie, no.
He cried, his voice raw with anguish. "Stay with me, Sophie.
Please."
She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain, but also with a profound sense of peace. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice weak. I love you," those were her last words. She closed her eyes, her body going limp in his arms. Alexander held her, his body shaking with grief, his tears flowing freely. He had lost her. He had lost everything. His world had collapsed, his dreams shattered, his heart broken beyond repair. But even in his grief, even in his despair, a flicker of something else ignited within him, A burning rage, a desperate need for revenge, a cold, hard determination to make Davies pay for what he had done. The reckoning had come, but it was not the reckoning Alexander had expected. It was a reckoning of loss, of grief, of a love that had been brutally extinguished. But it was also a reckoning of resolve, of a determination to honor Sophie's memory, to avenge her death, and to fight for the justice she deserved. The battle was far from over, and Alexander, fueled by grief and rage, was ready to wage war, to bring down Davies and his web of deceit, to expose the truth, and to find, if not redemption, then at least a measure of peace in a world that had been shattered by violence and betrayal. 75.1 S. Continued Chapter 16. Betrayal and Sacrifice. The death of Sophie galvanized Alexander. Grief and rage warred within him, but beneath the raw emotion, a cold, hard determination solidified. He would avenge her. He would make Davies pay. He would expose the truth, no matter the cost. Ashton, witnessing Alexander's devastation and the brutal reality of Davies's treachery, pledged his full support. He rallied his loyal men, and together, they planned their next move. They would not engage in a direct confrontation. Davies still had the advantage of numbers and official authority. Instead, they would use the very tools of espionage Davies had employed: stealth, deception, and the careful manipulation of information. Alexander, despite his grief, became a master strategist. He used his knowledge of Davies's network, his understanding of the intelligence community, and his own skills as a spy to turn the tables. He began to leak information, carefully crafted pieces of evidence that pointed to Davies's corruption and his fabrication of intelligence. He used his contacts, both old and new, to spread the word, to sow seeds of doubt within the ranks of the British intelligence service. The operation was risky, bordering on suicidal. Alexander was a wanted man, a known traitor, and Davies had powerful allies. But Alexander was driven by a force more powerful than fear: the memory of Sophie, her courage, her sacrifice, and the love that still burned brightly in his heart. Ashton, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to protect Alexander, providing him with safe houses, resources, and the support of his loyal soldiers. He also worked behind the scenes, using his influence to sway key figures within the government, planting seeds of doubt about Davies's integrity. The turning point came when Alexander managed to obtain concrete proof of Davies's treachery: a series of coded letters between Davies and a French double agent, outlining their conspiracy to fabricate intelligence and manipulate military operations for personal gain. Alexander, with Ashton's help, delivered the letters to a trusted member of Parliament, a man known for his integrity and his commitment to justice. The revelation caused a scandal, shaking the foundations of the British intelligence community. Davies, cornered and exposed, attempted to flee, but Alexander, anticipating his move, intercepted him. Their confrontation was not a battle of guns, but a battle of wills, a clash of ideologies, a final reckoning between a man driven by love and justice and a man consumed by greed and ambition. Alexander, fueled by his grief and his rage, could have easily killed Davies. He had the opportunity, the justification, the burning desire for revenge. But he didn't. He remembered Sophie, her compassion, her belief in redemption, her unwavering commitment to justice. Instead, he disarmed Davies, captured him, and delivered him to the authorities, ensuring that he would face trial for his crimes. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. Justice would be served, but it wouldn't bring Sophie back. The betrayal had been deep, the sacrifice immense. But in the end, truth had prevailed, and the web of lies had been unraveled. Alexander had avenged Sophie's death, not through violence, but through justice, honoring her memory and the values she had held dear. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, would remain, but a new chapter had begun, a chapter where hope, however fragile, could begin to blossom again. The price of loyalty had been paid, in full, and the seeds of redemption had been sown, watered by tears of grief and fertilized by the unwavering determination to honor the memory of a love that had been lost, but never forgotten. 63.5s, continued Chapter 17. Into the Lion's Denver. The aftermath of Davies's arrest was a whirlwind of investigations, trials, and political maneuvering. Alexander, though initially treated with suspicion, was eventually exonerated, his actions deemed justifiable, his loyalty to his country re-established. Ashton's testimony, along with the overwhelming evidence against Davies, played a crucial role in clearing Alexander's name. But the victory felt hollow. Sophie was gone, and no amount of justice could bring her back. Alexander found himself adrift, his purpose lost, his heart shattered. He had avenged her death, but he couldn't escape the crushing weight of his grief, the constant reminder of his loss. He was offered a position within the British intelligence service, a chance to rebuild his career, to return to the life he had once known. But he refused. He couldn't go back to that world, to the world of shadows and deception, to the world that had taken Sophie from him. He decided to leave England, to travel, to try to find some measure of peace, some way to make sense of his life, to honor Sophie's memory in a way that felt meaningful. He sold the safe house, distributed the remaining funds amongst Sophie's relatives and to the orphanage she had supported, and booked passage on a ship bound for America. But before he could leave, he received an unexpected summons. He was ordered to appear before a special tribunal, a clandestine gathering of high-ranking officials from both the British and French governments. He was confused, apprehensive. He had been exonerated, his name cleared. What more could they want from him? He arrived at the designated location, a stately manor house in the English countryside, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He was escorted into a large, ornate room, where a group of somber-faced men and women awaited him. He recognized some of them, British intelligence officers, government officials, military leaders. But there were also unfamiliar faces, men and women who spoke with French accents, who carried themselves with an air of authority and intrigue. Ashton was among them, standing near the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He gave Alexander a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement, a gesture of support. A British official, a man Alexander recognized as the head of the intelligence service, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hamilton," he said, his voice formal, "we have summoned you here today to discuss a matter of utmost importance." Alexander waited, his body tense, his mind racing. He had no idea what to expect. The official continued, "As you know, the war between Britain and France continues. Despite recent setbacks, Napoleon remains a formidable threat. We need to find a way to end this conflict, to secure a lasting peace." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, his eyes finally settling on Alexander. "And we believe you can help us." Alexander was stunned. He was a broken man, a former spy, a traitor in the eyes of many. How could he possibly help end the war? A French official, a woman with a sharp, intelligent face and a piercing gaze, stepped forward. "Monsieur Hamilton," she said, her voice accented but clear. "We know of your relationship with Comtesse Sophie de Valois." Alexander's heart clenched. Sophie's name, spoken in this context, felt like a fresh wound. "We also know of her involvement with the French resistance," the woman continued, "and of her sacrifice." Alexander felt a wave of grief wash over him, the pain of his loss still raw and overwhelming. "The Comtesse," the woman said, her voice softening slightly, "was a patriot. A brave and dedicated woman who fought for her country, for her beliefs." She paused, her eyes meeting Alexander's. "She also left behind information that could be crucial to ending this war." Alexander's mind reeled. Sophie? Information? What was she talking about? The woman continued, "We believe the Comtesse entrusted this information to you, Monsieur Hamilton. We believe you are the key to unlocking her secrets, to fulfilling her final mission." Alexander was being asked to step back into the lion's den, to return to the world of espionage, to the world that had taken Sophie from him. But this time it was different. This time it was not for duty, not for country, but for Sophie. For her memory, for her legacy, for the chance to complete the mission she had sacrificed her life for. He was being given an opportunity not just for redemption, but for something more, a chance to honor the woman he loved, to make her sacrifice mean something, to bring an end to the war that had claimed her life. He had a choice to make, a choice that would determine not only his own future, but the future of two nations. 20.4s, continue chapter 18. The heart of the matter. Alexander was hesitant, torn between his desire to honor Sophie's memory and his reluctance to return to the world of espionage. He had seen enough of war, of deceit, of betrayal. He yearned for peace, for a life free from the shadows and the constant threat of danger. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore Sophie's legacy, her commitment to her country, her unwavering belief in justice. He couldn't turn his back on the opportunity to complete her mission, to make her sacrifice meaningful, to contribute to a lasting peace. He looked at the faces around the room, the British and French officials, their expressions a mixture of hope and expectation. He saw Ashton, his friend, his ally, his gaze unwavering, his silent support a source of strength. He thought of Sophie, her courage, her compassion, her unwavering spirit. He remembered her last words, her declaration of love, her final sacrifice.
He knew what he had to do.
"All right," he said, his voice firm, his resolve hardening. "I'll do it. I'll help you find the information." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. The tension that had been palpable moments before dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. The French official, the woman who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. "Thank you, Monsieur Hamilton," she said, her voice sincere. "We are grateful for your cooperation." She introduced herself as Madame Du Bois, a twist of fate. Alexander thought that her name was the same as the alias he'd used, a high-ranking member of the French intelligence service. She explained that Sophie had been working on a clandestine operation, gathering information about a secret alliance between Napoleon and a group of powerful European bankers. This alliance, if successful, would provide Napoleon with the financial resources he needed to continue the war indefinitely, potentially shifting the balance of power in his favor. Sophie had discovered the identities of the key players involved, the details of their financial transactions, and the location of a hidden cache of documents that would provide irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. But she had been unable to transmit the information to the French resistance before her death. Alexander realized the magnitude of Sophie's mission, the incredible risk she had taken, the profound impact her success would have had on the outcome of the war. He also realized the danger he was now facing. He was stepping into Sophie's shoes, taking on her mission, inheriting her enemies. Madame Du Bois explained that they believed Sophie had hidden the information somewhere in Paris, somewhere she trusted, somewhere only she would know. They had searched her apartment, her family's estate, her known haunts, but they had found nothing. "We believe you are our last hope, Monsieur Hamilton," Madame Du Bois said, her eyes fixed on his. "You knew the Countess intimately. You shared her secrets. You loved her. We believe you can find what we have failed to find." Alexander felt the weight of their expectations, the burden of Sophie's legacy, the immense responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. He was no longer just a former spy, a grieving lover, a man seeking redemption. He was the key to unlocking Sophie's secrets, to fulfilling her final mission, to potentially ending the war that had claimed her life. He was being asked to return to Paris, to the city where he had met Sophie, where he had fallen in love with her, where he had betrayed her, and where she had died. He was being asked to retrace her steps, to relive their shared memories, to confront the ghosts of his past. It was a daunting task, a dangerous mission, a journey into the heart of darkness. But he was ready. He was driven by love, by grief, by a burning desire to honor Sophie's memory and to make her sacrifice mean something. He was going back into the lion's den, not as a predator, but as a protector, not as a spy, but as a lover, not as a traitor, but as a hero. He was going to find Sophie's secrets, and he was going to bring them to light, no matter the cost. The heart of the matter was not just about ending the war, it was about honoring the woman he loved, about fulfilling her legacy, and about finding, in the midst of loss and grief, a measure of peace and redemption. 55.7s, continued chapter 19. A desperate gamble. Alexander returned to Paris, a city steeped in memories, both beautiful and painful. He was accompanied by Ashton, who had insisted on joining him, providing support and protection. They were also assigned a small team of French agents, led by Madame Dubois, who would provide logistical support and intelligence. The city was a different place than the one Alexander had left. The war had taken its toll, the atmosphere tense, the people weary. The opulence of the salons had faded, replaced by a sense of grim determination, a collective yearning for an end to the conflict. Alexander, disguised as a scholar, began his search, retracing Sophie's steps, revisiting the places they had shared, the haunts they had frequented. He spent hours in libraries, archives, and museums, poring over old documents, searching for clues, for any hint of Sophie's secret mission. He visited the orphanage she had supported, the hospital where she had tended to the wounded, the church where she had prayed. He spoke to her friends, her acquaintances, her colleagues, gathering fragments of information, piecing together the puzzle of her final days. But the information remained elusive. Sophie had been meticulous, her secrets well guarded, her movements carefully concealed. She had trusted no one, knowing the risks, knowing the consequences of exposure. Alexander felt a growing sense of frustration, a desperate fear that he would fail, that he would be unable to fulfill Sophie's legacy, to honor her memory. He was haunted by her ghost, by her presence, by the constant reminder of his loss. One evening, as he was sitting alone in a small cafe, a place he and Sophie had often visited, he remembered a conversation they'd had, a seemingly insignificant exchange about a particular book, a rare volume of poetry that Sophie had cherished. He remembered the book's title, its author, and the specific edition Sophie had owned. He also remembered that she had kept the book not in her library, but in her private study, a small, secluded room in her apartment that she used for her personal correspondence and her secret work. He realized, with a sudden surge of hope, that the book might be the key, the hiding place, the repository of Sophie's secrets. He immediately contacted Madame Dubois, sharing his theory, his intuition, his desperate hope. Madame Dubois, initially skeptical, agreed to search Sophie's apartment again, focusing on the private study, on the specific book Alexander had described. The search was tense, painstaking. The apartment had been ransacked by the authorities after Sophie's death, its contents disturbed, its secrets seemingly exposed. But Alexander insisted that they look closer, that they examine every detail, that they leave no stone unturned. Finally, after hours of searching, one of the French agents found it. The book, a slim volume bound in worn leather, was hidden in plain sight, tucked away on a shelf amongst other books of similar appearance. But it wasn't the book itself that was important.
It was what was inside.
Carefully, the agent opened the book, revealing a hollowed-out compartment, a secret space hidden within the pages. Inside, they found a small, tightly rolled package, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with wax. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was it. This was Sophie's legacy, her final mission, the information that could change the course of the war. It was a desperate gamble, a leap of faith, a journey into the unknown. But it had paid off. Alexander had found Sophie's secrets, not through espionage, not through force, but through love, through memory, through the connection that still bound them together, even in death. The book, a symbol of their shared passion, had become the key to unlocking her final mission, a testament to the enduring power of love and the unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. 29.1 S. Continued Chapter 20. Redemption's Dawn. The package contained a wealth of information, detailed accounts of the secret alliance between Napoleon and the European bankers, names, dates, financial transactions, and copies of incriminating correspondence. It was everything Sophie had promised and more. It was irrefutable proof of the conspiracy, evidence that could bring down powerful men, disrupt Napoleon's war machine, and potentially pave the way for a lasting peace. Alexander, Ashton, and Madame Dubois worked tirelessly to verify the information, to cross-reference the details, to ensure its authenticity. They knew that the stakes were incredibly high, that any mistake, any misstep, could have devastating consequences. Once they were confident that the information was genuine, they presented it to the British and French governments, sharing the evidence with key officials, military leaders, and political figures. The revelation caused a shockwave, sending ripples of disbelief and outrage throughout the corridors of power. The European bankers, exposed and disgraced, withdrew their support for Napoleon, their financial empire crumbling under the weight of the scandal. Napoleon, deprived of his crucial funding, was forced to reconsider his military strategy, to scale back his ambitions, to negotiate a peace treaty. The war, which had raged for years, claiming countless lives and devastating entire nations, finally came to an end. A fragile peace was established, a new era of cooperation and diplomacy dawned, and the threat of Napoleon's domination was extinguished. Alexander, though hailed as a hero, a man who had single-handedly changed the course of history, found little solace in the accolades. He had fulfilled Sophie's mission, he had honored her memory, he had contributed to a lasting peace. But he had also lost the woman he loved, and that loss would forever remain a part of him. He was offered a knighthood, a position of power and influence within the British government. But he refused. He had no desire for titles, for honors, for a life of privilege. He had seen enough of war, of deceit, of betrayal. He yearned for something simpler, something more meaningful. He decided to return to Lyon, to Sophie's home, to the place where she had lived, where she had loved, where she had fought for her beliefs. He purchased a small cottage near her family's estate, and he dedicated his life to honoring her memory, to continuing her work, to supporting the causes she had held dear. He became a patron of the local orphanage, a benefactor of the hospital, a champion of the poor and the downtrodden. He used his skills, his knowledge, his connections to help those in need, to make a difference in the world, to live a life of purpose and meaning. He never forgot Sophie. He visited her grave every day, placing fresh flowers on her tombstone, whispering words of love and gratitude. He kept her memory alive in his heart, in his actions, in his unwavering commitment to the ideals she had embodied. Redemption's dawn had finally arrived, not in a blaze of glory, not in a triumphant victory, but in a quiet, peaceful act of remembrance, in a life dedicated to service, in a love that transcended death. Alexander had found peace, not in the accolades of the world, but in the fulfillment of Sophie's legacy, in the knowledge that her sacrifice had not been in vain, in the enduring power of a love that had blossomed in the midst of war and had ultimately helped to bring about a lasting peace. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer wounds, but reminders of the journey he had taken, the woman he had loved, and the future he had helped to create. The spy had found redemption, not in the shadows of espionage, but in the light of love, in the legacy of a woman who had changed his life forever. Epilogue. Years later, an old man sat on a bench in a quiet garden, overlooking the rolling hills of Lyon. His hair was white, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and peace. It was Alexander, his body aged by time, but his spirit still strong, his heart still filled with the memory of Sophie. He was surrounded by children, orphans from the local orphanage, their laughter echoing through the air. He told them stories, tales of adventure, of courage, of love, his voice gentle, his eyes twinkling with warmth. He had become a beloved figure in the community, a man known for his kindness, his generosity, his unwavering commitment to helping others. He had found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose, a life that honored Sophie's memory and fulfilled her legacy. He often thought of Sophie, of her beauty, her intelligence, her unwavering spirit. He remembered their stolen moments, their stolen kisses, their desperate flight from danger, their shared dream of a future together. He knew that she was with him, always in his heart, in his thoughts, in his actions. He felt her presence in the gentle breeze, in the blooming flowers, in the laughter of the children. He had lived a long and full life, a life filled with both joy and sorrow, with triumph and loss, with betrayal and redemption. He had been a spy, a soldier, a lover, a fugitive, a hero, and a friend. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also witnessed its best, its capacity for love, for compassion, for sacrifice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Alexander felt a sense of contentment, a feeling of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had found his redemption, not in the accolades of the world, but in the quiet fulfillment of Sophie's legacy, in the love that had endured through time and loss, in the knowledge that he had made a difference in the world. He closed his eyes, a gentle smile on his lips. He could almost hear Sophie's laughter, feel her touch, see her beautiful face. He knew that they would be reunited someday, in a place where there was no war, no deceit, no betrayal, only love. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Alexander whispered her name, a silent prayer, a final farewell, a promise of a love that would last forever. The epilogue was not an ending, but a continuation, a testament to the enduring power of love, the transformative power of loss, and the enduring legacy of a woman who had changed his life forever. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, there is always the possibility of redemption, and there is always the promise of a love that transcends time and space.